Welcome to The Plain Truth, a show where we try to get into some of the mysteries, anomalies, and the dirty underbelly of the world around us. I'm your host, Plain, otherwise known as Paul, and this week we have a special guest, Joaquin Flores, who is someone quite knowledgeable about geostrategic issues and the struggle over Eurasia and such things. Joaquin, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Well, thanks so much for coming. We appreciate it. And along for the ride is my friend Jerry. Jerry, are you there?
Hey guys, how you doing?
Okay, well, let's just get down to the heart of the matter here. Joaquin, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? I guess you're an American living in Serbia. You know, if you could tell us about your websites and how you ended up doing the kind of things you've been doing.
Sure. I have a master's degree from Cal State LA. I'm in international relations, focused mostly on ideology, terrorism, and geopolitics. And I, as a youth, was involved in some youth gangs connected to 18th Street and the prison gang Sudeños, but I've never been incarcerated. And put myself through school. And after a long struggle, I studied there, like I said, and focused as well on Sovietology. And I had a professor who recommended that I pursue my interests and travel and live abroad. And his name is Dr. Michael J. Seiler at Cal State Los Angeles. And I have been analyzing events in the region, focusing strictly on the Balkans for the last 10 years, but also Eastern Europe. And my sense of things and my, I guess you would say my forecasting is that things are going to get really, really interesting as they have started to already now and in the coming months and years.
Well, I like that bit about Sovietology. You know, that might be quite interesting now because that would seem to apply more to the U.S. than to the Russian area, right? I mean, isn't D.C. more like the old Moscow?
Right. And what's interesting is that one of the more notable Sovietologists is Condoleezza Rice.
Yeah, that is so appropriate. By the way, you have your information can be found at a couple of websites, right? Could you tell our listeners about those?
Yeah, there's a 4pt.su, which is connected to the fourth position in Alexander Dugin. And there, some of my writings are under my name, Joaquin Flores, and I have a pen name, J.V. Capone. And I've written on issues about disintegration in the United States, and I've also written about issue of the situation in Turkey with the so-called Turkish Spring that started to kick off last June, and some of the big changes we're going to see in Turkey, of course, in connection to events in Eastern Europe. It's all sort of connecting region, as you can see on a map. And my own website is Center for Syncretic Studies. It's an upstart, small in the WordPress format, and we're expanding. But I've been able to recruit some local doctors and professors in the area of ideology and geostrategy from the faculty of Belgrade. And so now we're working together. And recently I worked through the Center for Syncretic Studies on the last parliamentary campaign for the Radical Party, which is a fairly mainstream political party here in the Republic of Serbia.
Well, I'm glad to hear that there's a country somewhere where the Radical Party is mainstream. That's good
Right.
to know.
It is.
Well, you brought up Turkey. Well, why don't we start about that? Because there's been this tape released, that they wanted to have a false flag to attack Syria. And I guess the election there is going on today or something as we speak, more or less.
That's right.
And so there seems to be this U.S. war against Erdogan. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, what's happening right now with Turkey is basically the Saudis and the Turks began a joint project to destroy Syria, and as it evolved, they ended up on opposite ends of that equation, and so the whole thing in Syria splintered. And there had been a plan from last year that Turkey wanted to fake a false flag and make it look like Syria had attacked them to justify mobilizing more forces at the border. And of course, there are some border regions where you have, Syrians living in Turkey, and you have Kurds living on both sides, and you have Turks living in Syria. So it's all, one could see how easily that could become a big, big mess. But the things that, are also pulling at Erdogan is he's losing control of the judiciary system, and a big trial that had gone down starting 6 years ago to put an end to what was called the Ergenekon conspiracy to bring down the Erdogan's state and the AKP failed. And one of the major leaders of the Workers' Party, who's like a left-wing Kemalist nationalist who owns a TV station and has big connections with top brass in the military, he was released, and this was a big upset for Erdogan. And so things could get very, very interesting in Turkey.
Do you think they'll manage to escalate with Syria, or do you think that they're kind of on their last legs with that, and they're just trying to clean up by getting rid of the radical terrorist insurgents?
Right. I think both things are happening, and that's why it's so fascinating and so unpredictable, because, still there's an element in the U.S. that wants to push him to go to attack Syria, and Israel would support Turkey in that scenario. And you may have read recently talk about, a warming of Turkish-Israeli relations, and Israel has tried to act somewhat as a middleman and broker between the relations between Turkey and Saudi Arabia, which have really gone south. And so what's happening now is that the Russians have been developing the science of the color revolution and how to deploy NGOs like the U.S. does. And so there are Russian NGOs operating in Turkey, which I've written about on the 4PTSU website. And these NGOs are also behind what are the Turkish Spring. So somewhat different from the Arab Spring and color revolutions we've seen in other places. The Turkish Spring is sort of a different phenomenon because it involves both Western and Eurasian tendencies sort of pulling at both ends of this popular uprising, which is in process. So it's very, very sticky and very interesting.
Well, it's interesting what you said about how Russia is working on the color revolution template. So when is the American Spring? Is Russia today gonna kick it off for us?
Yeah, Russia Today probably actually will, cover that, and they covered, the Occupy Wall Street thing, which was kind of like the American Spring, except for some major provisos. Primarily that it was preemptive, and many people feel that it was meant to derail or frustrate some of Ron Paul's presidential ambitions. And at the same time, there was an attempt a year and a half ago during the Russian elections. The George Soros-based groups and other organizations like Open Society and National Endowment for Democracy and related NGOs like Otpor and Canvas were operating in Russia, and they tried to do like an Occupy Moscow, which failed miserably because Putin was able to basically use the loyal opposition, which is the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, to basically take over the protest and turn a hostile opposition protest into a loyal opposition protest. And the U.S. did the same thing by deploying, trade union leaders and agents within the Democratic Party to basically try to wrestle control of Occupy Wall Street from the hands of more radical elements, either libertarian or more communistic.
They did the same thing with the Tea Party on the right as well. They sort of co-opted that movement, which was a grassroots rebellion of the Republican side.
Absolutely, yeah. The Koch brothers were behind that, weren't they?
I don't think Koch. Yeah, I don't think they were originally behind it. I think they spent a lot of money to take it over. They're interesting because they're really actually on both the left and the right, although left folks have this image that they're just on the right. I think they were a big funder of Bill Clinton, for example. They're just opportunistic establishmentarian criminals. I mean, nothing, to make them stand out.
Right.
Not necessarily as well known or as important as Soros, but Soros is more international, whereas they're more domestic. But look, this is a template, and the interesting thing is the Russians are starting to play games. What about all of these tapes that have been released in the last couple of months? I mean, these are pretty dramatic tapes we're hearing. Do you think these are largely coming from the Russians?
They are. The Russians obviously have an interest in having these released, and in reality, sympathies aside, of course, one would imagine that the FSB would be involved on some level. Now, that doesn't mean that these are necessarily hoaxes or that these are fraudulent tapes, but they definitely are involved in releasing them. And Snowden, to the extent that he might not be an agent of the U.S., maybe also be playing a role, but that would be speculation on my part. I'm sure some of you guys probably have better information there, and certainly your listeners know all about that. So
I think most of the calls are actually confirmed by the people that were involved in them as being authentic. Although some of them, like Timoshenko, says that they massaged what she says, but I find
Right.
I find that rather dubious.
Yeah, what Timoshenko said was definitely her saying, and the talk about killing the Russian majority in the East is absolutely what she's all about. Now something about her that's interesting is that her whole political career has been based on fraudulence and basically lying about who she is and where she comes from, and she was always a Russian speaker and then only learned Ukrainian language in the late 80s and early 90s, and then had to try to perfect an East Ukrainian accent and dialect, and she says that she's purely Lithuanian and Ukrainian when in fact she's Armenian and Russian Jewish.
Well, you can see her being propped up to take the reins of power again, but I mean, from what I've seen, people on both the pro-Ukrainian and the pro-Russian side, neither one of the people actually want her.
Yeah, neither want her, but what the U.S. is planning to do, and if people who followed the script and saw how it was going, basically Yatsenyuk did the deal for the IMF, the 16 or so billion of the IMF. So instantly he's going to be hated. And the day that he assumed office back on February 27th, he said, I'm going to be the least popular Ukrainian politician in history. So he knew what his role was. So the way they're setting up this script is that everyone's going to hate Yatsenyuk. And then Timoshenko, they're going to have her run against someone like, say, Turchinov. But then they're also going to have people like Klitschko. And then they're also going to have people like Yarosh from the Pravi sector. And between all those people, Timoshenko is going to seem like the most knowledgeable, most experienced, and most rational person. So the U.S. is going to get behind Timoshenko in that case.
So it's just like the U.S. elections. It's the lesser of all the evils.
Exactly. So it's just about making sure that her opponents are more disgusting than she is.
Well, Joaquin, I think that there might be conflicting scripts, and I'm not sure it's going to be quite so simple. But first, let me tell you a joke I saw on Twitter. It says there's a Ukrainian joke going around. So what do you get when you have a boxer, a Nazi, a chocolate oligarch, and a gas princess all in the same room?
What?
A Ukrainian presidential race.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Right? I mean, that sounds about right. But the boxer Klitschko just pulled out today or whatever, yesterday or something. And
He's going to run.
Yeah, I'm not sure how clear it is because, first of all, it might get bloody. And so I'm not, it'll be interesting to see. But what stands out to me is there are probably something like 24 political prisoners at the moment. And the guy who might well win the election would be the guy from Kharkov, the governor or whatever he was, the Russian who resigned to immediately run for president.
Mm-hmm.
And they put him under house arrest, and they won't let him, get any PR or whatever. But by trying to ban the Russian language, which a majority of the country use in their daily life all the time, and trying to nuke Russians, you're going to have a radicalized Russian population. And so it wouldn't be a surprise that a guy like that would win if they had a fair race. And the other thing, of course, is that all of these weirdos, or whatever you want to call them, brown shirts and boxers and gas crooks and stuff like that, could theoretically divide their vote, right? So the western part of the country might end up having 3 different candidates, and the Russians might unite around this reasonably popular guy. And so the whatever you want to call it, the American perspective or whatever, the NATO perspective is you've got to, well, first of all, it's simple. You arrest or kill guys from the other side, but then you probably have a choice between either uniting on one candidate or else, kind of more in the American style, is you unite in the sense you have one serious candidate and then you have a bunch of fake candidates.
Right. And another thing that's also happening is that there's also been some pushback from the constitutionality itself of calling for a presidential and parliamentary election in the first place. And so what's being pushed and what the Russians are pushing and what the Russians in Ukraine are pushing is for a referendum to change the constitution, to change Ukraine into a federal republic, and then that would grant each of the federal oblasts would become federal regions, and then these different oblasts would then have some more autonomy, and then you might see sort of an increase or replication of some of the things that happened in Crimea, where region by region they say, okay, we rather join with the Russian Federation, and so you might see a line going right down the river, splitting Ukraine in half. So that's another scenario, and so what I would want to emphasize to your listeners about a script is that they're playing chess, and you can't always predict what their moves are going to be. So there's a high degree of fluidity, and the U.S. and European Union are also at odds, and they don't have the same goals, and they don't want the same things, but what each faction and each power group does is going to be based upon the actions of the other, and they're all trying to behave strategically.
For sure. I mean, I guess we might just kind of get your take on one big thing. Do you think Putin set a trap? Do you think this was kind of, how can we say, a strategy of judo?
Yeah, this, he was sort of given a gift and set a trap at the same time. I mean, it's the division between DC and Berlin has been growing, and it's sort of one of the things that doesn't get discussed too much. But there's over 10,000 German enterprises operating in Russia, so that helps to explain some of the reasons why Angela Merkel can't support sanctions against Russia. I mean, hurting or sanctioning Russia hurts Germany, and the U.S. has really tried to juggle its policy and its approach to Eurasian and European matters, and now they're sort of starting to approach an impasse where basically the trilateralists and the unilateralists really can't be on the same page and within the United States, to the extent that there still are trilateralists, and to the extent that the neocons haven't fully marginalized the trilateralists. But it's also interesting to see how, like you said, Putin was able to sort of predict these things. Many people say, look, the Russians are playing chess, but the Americans are playing checkers. And there's been a notable geostrategist who have said that, strategic thinking in the U.S. has really taken a nosedive. Now, if you ask my opinion, I think the U.S. operating at the very, very high levels has some extremely intelligent people who can see what's coming around the corner. But they're certainly acting like they're stupid, and that raises some big questions.
Do you think, Joaquin, that maybe Putin made a strategic mistake by not pressing the military into Ukraine? Like, would he maybe been better off to just go straight to the river from the get-go? Because from my perspective, these sanctions and all these punishments, I would assume that he would have got the same treatment had he done that as he's getting now for what happened in Crimea, which was essentially, people making the sort of deciding their own destiny, right?
Right. Well, I think it was a Machiavellian calculation on Putin's part, and certainly he's done his reading and he knows the prince, and he also knows Xenophon's Cyropaedia, because this is required reading in the Soviet Union at the time. And one of the maxims is don't take by force what you can receive without force. And so I think if he had to, I think if it came to that, they were prepared to use the military. You probably read the report that he went to the Duma and he received authorization to use the military if it went that direction. But they really were pushing their soft power angle, and it looked for a long time, and it still looks like they've been able to get the European Union on their side on certain key issues, and they've been able to break the Brussels policy from Washington policy on a few key issues surrounding Ukraine. So I think that's why he didn't have to use the military. And, you could be right, though. I mean, maybe it would have been smarter, but I think that at the same time that Russia is really, really playing the, human rights angle, or, sovereignty and sort of the basic founding premises of the UN and respecting sovereignty and things like that. And they would not need to use their own military directly in the same way that the U.S. Doesn't have to use its own military directly in Libya or in Syria, right? So they have a lot of proxy agents, and they have a lot of ways of looking like things that are happening in Ukraine are purely, happening from Ukrainian people, even though the Russians are deeply involved and are pulling some strings. So, maybe that's a smarter way, but time will tell.
I guess my concern is just that, what's going to end up happening from my perspective is Putin's going to probably support an insurgency with the eastern and southern regions, and that's going to be a little bit more bloody, I think. And had he just rolled the military in and taken over, I think it would have probably been in some respects easier on the people.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I certainly think that things that Putin does are open to criticism, but I also know that I figure that, whatever I know, there's people at higher levels who've already thought about what I'm thinking about, and they've definitely sat in the war room for weeks and months and years on end, kind of playing out all the scenarios, and this is what they came up with. So there's got to be some good reason for it. Certainly, the Russians have showed some very astute long-term thinking over a number of issues, whether it was in Georgia or in Libya or in Syria, and they've been able to basically get the U.S. to withdraw and back down in Syria simply by not agreeing, and by not agreeing over the chemical weapons issue, and by being firm there. And
Joaquin,
Mm-hmm.
Sorry to interrupt, but I think the main thing that the Russians have managed to get America to agree on is that Russia has very, very good missiles and anti-missile technology.
Right.
Okay, so let's be honest here.
Right. That's definitely the largest part of it, right? So yeah, would they need to roll the military into Ukraine? I don't know. I mean, I think that another thing to consider is that the Ukrainian military, the FSB, former KGB, has just so many assets and so many contacts with people. This is like a common culture and a related language, and all the Ukrainian brass are also fluent in Russian, and the ones who are over a certain age, all studied in Moscow. So it's not like these people don't know each other. So I mean, does the Ukraine really even have an army? Is a question that I've raised before. I mean, I don't think that Ukraine actually has a military that it could mobilize, and there are many generals in the so-called Ukrainian army, who, in the event of some conflict, would stand down or would actually just side with the pro-Russian breakaway parts of Ukraine. That's why you're seeing, Blackwater Z and Israeli paramilitary mercenaries be brought today into Ukraine.
The IMF has to protect their investment, Joaquin.
Right.
Well, I think let's, Jerry, your question is, should the Russians have moved in? to save life. And by the way, Joaquin, I would say not just save life. Russia has a lot of key industries, from the military-industrial complex and some other things there, and they're going to be degraded as things collapse.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's, it's going to cost more to try to rebuild if things really, if you get to the point where there's an insurgency and all that other kind of stuff, right?
Right.
And all of that would have been saved if they just moved in. But I think Jerry, you got to factor in a couple of things here. One is that Putin and the Russians have been playing up the importance of international law for 15 years, right? And yes, Yanukovych is, sitting there saying he wants to be restored and all that, but it's messy. If the Russians have to come in with troops, it looks messy. And
it looks messy. It leaves a bad taste, and it
leaves a bad taste.
Yeah.
The other thing I think is important is, we don't know how they're wargaming it, but, if they set up some confederations where you're allowed to secede if you want, it's possible that the Western, let's say 1/4 or maybe 1/3, would say, hey, we want out of this.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
But if that were to happen, though, that'd be a terrible problem for the EU or Poland or whoever, right? Do you want a bunch of radicalized groups that only disagree on who to shoot first? I mean, do we kill all the Poles first? Do we kill all the Jews first? No. And the unifying candidate wants to kill the Russians first, right? Now imagine you got that as an independent country in the western fourth of the current Ukraine. And then you're left with, Kiev and the Russian areas and Odessa all being part of whatever you want to call it, Little Russia or Little Ukraine. I mean, that would be a far better deal for Russia than if the Russian troops go in and take 1/3 of the country and basically under force say these are our brothers or whatever.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Paul. And also consider that in the situation we're looking at, that under international law and the precedent of continuity of obligations, that the existing agreements between Russia and Ukraine are still in effect. And so, for example, when it was announced that the IMF approved the $16 billion for Ukraine, there has to be a Ukraine to borrow that money. And the Russians kind of like that there's an independent Ukraine as well, because, they get repaid, I think, neighborhood of $4 to $6 billion based on different calculations immediately. So about 1/3 of that goes right over to the Russians. So the IMF actually just handed about $4 or $5 billion over to Russia with that announcement. And there has to be a Ukraine in order for that to happen.
Well, we keep talking about international law, but it's hard to be on one side that respects the international law, and your other side, international law is good when it works in our favor, but when it doesn't go in our favor, then screw international law. So it seems like he's kind of playing a rigged game here.
Absolutely.
Well, look, the fact is we don't know, and we don't know what we don't have access to their information. They got spies. Russia is so totally integrated into the Ukraine that they've got, like you're saying, I mean, the entire military over the age of 50 or whatever, 45, is totally trained in Moscow, right? And then more than half the country speaks Russian every day as their normal language. So, I mean, when people say there are 8 million Russians or some number, yeah, but that's like saying how many Americans are in California. If California were broken off and, became an independent country because China had the military power to do it, and they said there are X million number of Americans in there, but we don't include somebody who's half black and half Armenian, right?
Right. Who identifies?
It's like, well, what is he if he isn't American? I mean, what language does he speak? What school did he go to? What books does he read? He is actually an American. He's just not like the American that you see on television or Hollywood.
Right. That's a real good point. Exactly.
I mean, the point is those 55 or 52% or whatever the numbers are in the Ukraine. I mean, they might be, 1/4 Volga German. They might be 1/4 Ukrainian and 1/4 Russian and 1/4 I don't know Belarusian or something. But the point is, as a practical matter, they consider themselves part of the Russian world, just as somebody growing up in California might consider himself part of the American world.
Yeah, I mean, during most of the history of the Soviet Union, Ukraine was its own Soviet Socialist Republic, but there wasn't this prevailing sense that there was some distinct entity or that there was a distinct quality of being Ukrainian, and it was understood then that the real Ukrainian ethnicity or the Ukrainian nationality wasn't the whole borders of the Ukrainian Federation, Soviet Socialist Republic, and so it's actually a much smaller little piece of land with a much smaller ethnic, Carpathian is what it is, ethnicity, and you're right, and you have basically people who are Galician and Polish in the northwest, and you have people who are Hungarian in the west, and of course in the south, where Crimea, they're a mixture of Greek and Russian and Ukrainian. So it's and so what happened in the early 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the U.S. was pushing hard to put in basically liberal nationalists, right, in both the Baltic states and in Ukraine. They basically began nation building, not state building, but they began a sort of rewriting the textbooks and teaching kids, a different version of history that emphasized the Ukrainian character of the Ukrainian state. And that had been at odds with what their parents learned, right? So you have a generational divide, too, where parents might feel more Russian and kids might feel more Ukrainian because of what they learned in school.
One of the things in the West, the Western media we keep hearing about is, the poor Tartars of Crimea, they don't want anything to do with this. But when I look at what Putin was offering them, I mean, he was giving them a pretty good deal, giving them more autonomy and I think right of return. And I think a lot of the Tartars actually supported Crimea returning to Russia.
That's right. Yeah, actually they did. But by numbers they did. One of the problems is that some of the smaller groups that got a lot of attention in the West staged a protest. And as you know, Islam in Russia is Sunnism. And so because of that fact, it opens up the possibility to get some Salafis who carry Wahhabism with them. And so what happened recently is, because you have the situation of Chechnya and Dagestan over to the east, and then you have Ukraine and the Crimea, where you still have a remnant Tartar population, is that the Turks, who have been helping to fund Salafists and Wahhabis south of them, actually tried to send a boat full of munitions, which was intercepted by the Russian Navy. And so there's actually been and this was frustrated, and this was reported back in February, but we could already see sort of the beginnings of how they might try to get a small radicalized element of the Tartars to do Israel or Washington's or Turkey's bidding.
Well, there were reports that essentially the reason the Russians moved into the Crimea and sealed it off, sealed the airports and all that, is that there were flights coming in, presumably with terror gangs, to destabilize Crimea.
Yep.
Presumably the usual NATO. I heard reports they were coming from Turkey and maybe also from Romania, but
that's
the Operation Gladio crowd. And
yep.
So they had to keep them out because you couldn't have an election or a referendum if you had things being blown up all over the place. And so, you could even argue in this case that Putin didn't even really want to have to be as dramatic with the Crimea as he was. But there was just no choice. I mean, NATO won't back off, so they have to protect themselves.
Yeah, one of NATO's goals in Ukraine was to evict the Russians. I mean, it sounds so stupid in retrospect, but they thought they might be able to evict the Russians from the Black Sea Fleet, their Black Sea Fleet from the ports.
Joaquin,
Yeah.
I'm from D.C. originally, and I'm looking forward to Russia evicting the U.S. fleet from Newport News and Norfolk. Okay, U.S. Navy's got to leave Virginia. That's it. That's my demand.
Yeah, right.
That's You first destroy the country, first nuke them, then do that. You got the order wrong.
Yeah.
Well, I guess why don't we move on a little bit to the question of the broader picture, not just the tactics on the ground there, but
Sure.
as we get into the struggle, let's say Russia, EU, and the U.S.
Right.
The high level, at what do they say, at the 30,000 foot level, flying across the ocean or something, it's really the U.S. trying to hold on to Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And, the question, and then Russia's trying to break that. And that's part of building a Eurasian community. And then you can argue that that's an issue of the sea power versus the land power that some people consider, like, of course, Alexander Dugin or Brzezinski.
Yes. Yeah, these doctrines have been around, of course, since the time of Mackinder and Reich and Carl Schmitt. The telluric power against the thalassocratic power. But it's what's interesting, I think, is that during the whole period of the Soviet Union, the debate among Soviet elites was whether they pursue basically militarily or through fomenting revolutions in Europe, that to take all of Europe, basically from Siberia to Lisbon, and or if they were going to neutralize Europe, and that was called that was the doctrine of Finlandization. And ultimately they went with the Finlandization, and that made it very, very difficult because they failed there. They couldn't break NATO through, it was called the peace movement, and things like détente made it look like that there could be some rapprochement, but ultimately that failed, and then you had significant figures like Gorbachev, and followed by even worse figures like Yeltsin. And it took a long time for the Russian state to sort of find coherence again, and the Kremlin basically went into turtle mode and was only able to reemerge in the late 90s after taking a hiatus for 10 years. And so some of the ideas that they need to now make a syncretic synthesis, a combination between both Finlandization and steamrolling. And that's been the Russian policy for the last 10 years.
Well, there are a lot of ways to approach it, but I would say one of the real problems they had is that, communism was funded by the Western bankers, and they were off and on independent, but never, not usually totally independent. And so, for example, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, after that ended, David Rockefeller went to Moscow, and like a week later, Khrushchev was removed. And, in other words, the Western networks, whatever they may be, financial, Freemasonic, whatever kind of networks they are, have been able to influence things in the Soviet Union or Russia or whatever. And indeed, right now, I think a big problem Putin has is the oligarchs, the rich people, and then also perhaps things like the diplomatic corps or the professors and such are very pro-Western. So it's kind of a fifth column in your own country.
Yeah, that's been difficult for them, and Russia's sort of path to sovereignty. It appears a lot to people like expansionism, and I think that when we think about things in terms of the U.S. empire or the British Empire and colonialism and expansionism, it's one sort of defect in Western academia is the tendency to try to create models or to modelize things, or to take a phenomenon, give it a term, and then transplant that description onto other phenomenon. Russian history, Russian culture, and Russian trajectory doesn't really fit modelization because historically Russia has waned and waxed. So there's periods in Russian history where they contract, and then they go through a period of expansion and contraction. And it's kind of like this more natural metabolic process that relates to all sorts of different intrigues, but also, of course, technological and industrial development as well.
Well, I guess the question, of course, at the moment, Russia's been on the rise. Under
Right.
Putin, they've had phenomenal economic growth, GDP, technological growth, whatever it is you're looking at. And so the question is, what does the EU see about that? By the way, this whole mess in the Ukraine, do you think the EU essentially wanted this to some degree, or was this?
Yeah, they didn't want things right now are going more in the direction that the EU wanted, but that took a big agreement between Washington and Brussels. The U.S., quite frankly, was really willing to go Samson, not literally, but they were willing to try to create a failed state in Ukraine if it meant severing the ties that connect Central Europe between Russia and Western Europe. And so because the U.S. can see that there's this trajectory through, oil and gas pipelines and, highways and technology and infrastructure and, telecommunications, which is, connecting Russia with Western Europe. And sort of similar to how, the Romans helped the Gauls, build roads and sort of helped create basically Roman institutions in Gaul, which paved the way, ultimately for Romans to, march in on the roads that the Gauls built using Roman technology. The U.S. can see that Russia and Europe are getting closer and closer, and the United States, as you know from the doctrines of Zbigniew Brzezinski or Henry Kissinger, that the Russian piece on the grand chessboard is the most significant, and as the center of the board, you've got to contain them. And if Russia has influence or friends, all the way to Lisbon or to Paris or even London, then that is catastrophic for the North American power base. So I think those are some of the questions that they're looking at, and that that's my opinion. And I think that now you can really see why. In retrospect, Nolan said, F the EU, because they knew that when they were going to back the neo-Nazis from the Pravi sector in Kiev, that it could lead to provoking a full-scale civil war and getting very bloody, but also creating a failed state. And it looks like for the time being, and of course things could change tomorrow, but it looks like for the time being that cooler heads have prevailed, that high-level talks between Moscow, Berlin, Brussels, and Washington have produced a consensus around the agreement that there's going to be an election, and it may be a referendum, constitutional referendum, it may be a presidential election, but they've agreed on that, and now, but things could still get very crazy. But for now, this has calmed some of the fears from the EU and stock markets, and certainly the IMF loan, which was just accepted for Ukraine, has also sort of patted down some of the fears that were had in Europe.
Do you think a lot of the the sanctions and a lot of the political grandstanding that we've been witnessing, do you think it's primarily just for show, or do you think any of it actually has any teeth?
Yeah, I mean, when you're a mid-level functionary, it's all very, very real, and when it's just like a Democrats against Republicans. Like when you work on those campaigns, it's a real campaign, and when you're a Republican and you're organizing against Democrats, it's a real fight. But at the highest level, it's like professional wrestling, right?
Or professional boxing. Both fighters are owned by Don King, right?
Right, exactly. So yeah, that's that, and I mean, sort of stepping back and looking at the meta politics or other big questions, and or maybe even exopolitics. I mean, who really knows? I mean, could be all along that the Russian establishment is trolling the whole population of the world, just like the American establishment, and that they all agree behind back doors that they're going to keep back technologies which might explode the entire scarcity-based economic paradigm. Who knows, right?
Well, that's a different question, Joaquin. I mean, from a Russian point of view, I mean, I don't think we can say this, but let's, for the sake of the argument, say that Putin is actually a really, really nice guy, and he's just a mean SOB fighting his enemies, right?
Right.
Okay, but if somebody comes along with an invention that means you don't need oil and gas, that would practically destroy the state of Russia.
And the United States.
Well, it would also damage the U.S. dramatically, but the U.S. would be in better shape in the sense that at least there's more of another technological economy to kind of turn to.
Right.
And, so, I mean, you'd have to remove such an inventor. I mean, you couldn't allow that out. I mean, it doesn't matter how nice of a guy you are. That would change the whole power politics of the world.
Absolutely. Right.
So when you start getting to the more hidden stuff, I mean, the secret weapons, the secret technology, well, that's a tough one. We get into the concept of a breakaway civilization and some of these tougher things, and not really the topic of today, but it is worth thinking about these things. But I got a question for you about the whole Eurasian thing, and then let's say the U.S.-NATO approach. There's a quote by Frederick the Great along the lines of, he who defends everything defends nothing. And the U.S. has kind of got bases in hundreds and hundreds of countries, and then just outposts for all kinds of political intrigue, like color revolutions all over the place. Do you think the U.S. is in danger of basically a collapse from imperial overstretch?
Overstretch is a significant factor, and I think that the first signs of overstretch we saw in the wars under Bush, and they had problems with morale and troop rotation, and then there was military benefits. You had Iraq veterans against the war. You've got fairly popular in the U.S. military, fairly popular websites like Veterans Today, and which are very critical of the U.S. imperial machine. The United States would have to do something to prevent an overstretch situation. Would have to do something like Amarian reforms, where they completely change their relationship with the military, how they pay them, what's in it for them, and that might not be enough. I can say personally, I support some ideas of secularism and religious freedom, but I think that at the same time, where you have in the United States, what reasons do people have to fight? What would soldiers be fighting for? Now, if you just have them, controlling drones, or as pilots dropping bombs, or if they're just doing relatively safe patrols, you can maintain that. But what happens when there's a 80% chance they're going to die? I mean, could the U.S. really pull off another Normandy invasion? That's a real big question. Funding-wise, we know that they print their own money and that they have black projects, and that they could probably do some manipulation of their own internal economy to fund military for some time. But I think the sort of larger questions about whether people would really fight have not really sufficiently been looked at.
Hey, Joaquin,
Yes.
Just to change the direction a bit, what are your thoughts on Iran? A couple questions I have there. Do you think that Israel will attack Iran? And also, what do you think the Russian stance is towards Iran? And how does that compete with the Russian stance towards Turkey?
Yeah, Iran and Israel really need each other. Both governments rely on the threat of the other, and in military terms, obviously Israel thinks that if it could win from a KO nuclear attack, but now that Iran has some strong military alliances with Russia, that would mean a counterattack from Russia. So then you're looking at basically, well, is Israel going to try to bomb Iranian facilities, and could they do that? Well, Iran is not Iraq, and Iran certainly has capacity to reach Tel Aviv pretty easily, and they project their power in the region. And I just don't see Israel pulling off an attack on Iran, and I think that the kind of attacks that we've seen are assassinations of nuclear physicists and spy rings getting busted or being successful, but a full-scale military, I mean, that would seem to be the death knell of the Israeli state.
Well, while we're on this, some people, we just recently interviewed Jim Willey, who's a financial kind of guy, are of the view that, how can I put it? Saudi Arabia is finding itself in desperate straits.
Mm-hmm.
And that Saudi Arabia, to survive, is going to need Chinese and Russian help. And that essentially there's a good chance there'll be an Iranian and Saudi détente.
Yeah, that's actually emerging right now through Egypt.
And it's speculative, but I'm not sure. Maybe it's from living in Los Angeles, but there are Iranians all over the place.
Yeah,
and they basically like the U.S. And of course they're the expats. But even the ones in Iran, I think, don't really hate the U.S. Right? So Iran could become a friend of the U.S. is the issue. And so from a Russian point of view, I don't know that you can totally trust Iran.
Yeah, Iran was on the U.S. side in the Third Balkans War, the war against Yugoslavia, right? And Clinton had an agreement with the Iranian establishment about that. And even though and part of this sort of exposes some of the mistakes that people make when they think that there's this like very solid line that divides, Sunni from Shia, because, while officially, of course, Iran is a Shia state, they built strong ties in the Balkans among Bosniaks and also Kosovo Albanians, and there were some Hezbollah and also professional army advisors in the Balkans on the American side, ostensibly, basically, they were triangulating, of course, and Iran. Also, and I have, respect for Iranian civilization. It's very old, and I would never mean to speak, negatively about their accomplishments or about what the Iranian Revolution has produced on its good side. But there's been lots of people for a long time who said that, yeah, you know what, even though the Shah was, sort of installed by the British and the Seven Sisters, the oil companies, that he began to kind of, reject them and push against them, and he also wasn't clamping down hard enough on the communists. And the Shah might have been playing a game where he might have tried to go in the direction of someone like Tito, also trying to get support from the Soviets, right? And so there's lots of people, and this is fairly credible, but I won't stand behind it. But I have to say it, or I'd be omitting it, that in fact that the Khomeini was in part working with the British MI6, right? And that he was sort of put in as a check on the Russians in the very first place. So yeah, these intrigues are complex. When people want to look at things in black and white and black hats versus white hats, or, Eurasia versus NATO, it's way more complicated than that, right? There's all kinds of different power groups and changes, and, people are way more flexible than we give them credit for.
Joaquin, do you remember the old Mad magazine Spy versus Spy?
Right, yeah, black hat and white hat, right, yeah.
You can tell them apart because they have different hats.
Right.
Okay, so I'm a little cynical here, but there's an old saying in the Middle East that behind every mullah's beard is a British agent.
Right. Lawrence
so I would say keep that in mind. And Lawrence of Arabia was just an Arab Spring 100 years before the current one.
Absolutely.
So you have to keep all of these things in mind. And the Iranians supported the Libyan massacre, which is really one of the more egregious sins of our era. So I think we have to understand that all of these pieces on the chessboard, it's kind of more like 5-dimensional chess or something. It's there are a lot of angles that people can be hit at, and so Iran is not a simple question. But I can't imagine that the Saudis are getting desperate. They have a Shia part of the country, and I guess that's got a lot of oil. Their oil is being depleted. Apparently, the production there is really in serious decline, and the population has exploded, right, compared to 30 years ago. And you have a totally dysfunctional state. I don't think they could manufacture bicycles if they tried. So what they've got is a lot of money. Yeah, but compared to Iran, that's a modern industrial country.
Right.
This is a country that can make high-tech missiles and send up satellites and stuff. And you're talking about a country that's got a lot of money, but really can hardly do anything. It just if the West pulled its advisors and technical people out, the water systems would collapse. The street lights would collapse.
Mhm.
I mean, it would be a sad sight. So
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
there's that element.
The Saudis have really failed to develop an intelligentsia of their own, and they're sorely lacking in intelligence, and they've because the ruling class is a genetic ruling class. There's an extreme lack of meritocracy and even perhaps competence. So.
Well, yeah, exactly. But I guess getting back to what I was trying to say with the whole Eurasian question is, it's like the U.S. has been imperially overstretched, but at the same time, it's kind of taking on more fights than it can handle.
Yeah,
and
agreed.
It raises the question, like you're saying, some of the people at the top are not at all stupid.
Right.
And so why is this happening? Right? I mean, you have to set priorities in this world. All of us have budgets. All of us have, knowledge of what we can do. I mean, whatever. And, to put troops in places where if anything goes wrong, they'll end up dying is a mistake. Well, how about we put it this way? It's worse than wrong. It's a mistake, right? Because demoralizing your military is a big, big mistake.
Right.
And that's already happened.
Right.
The officer corps, I think, in the U.S. is very, very unhappy. And even these wars that we see now, like the war in Syria, and for that matter, Libya and whatever, these are privatized wars.
Right.
The CIA is running these with the Saudis or the Turks or whoever. The military is saying, we don't want to do these things. They're bad ideas. They're immoral. They're fattening. Whatever. They just don't like it, and they certainly don't want to die for it.
Right.
Right. And this is demoralizing to the country because, from a military point of view, you're looking at being hopelessly overextended, all the while your country's at risk of going bankrupt.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And to have bases, I mean, we probably have bases in the Amazon. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's a big question, Paul. And I think, without getting to the issue of breakaway civilizations, I mean, I just think in mainstream terms, I mean, there's a huge lifestyle, culture, and wealth gap disparity in the U.S. between the have and have-nots, and it far exceeds what you see in any other modern industrialized first world country, and it parallels what you see in banana republics, and there's a big question as to the extent of just how out of touch are the ruling class or the ruling elite in the U.S. How out of touch are they with the situation on the ground in the States? I mean, are they getting good feedback? Do they know what the people are willing to take? Will the people rise up? How are they going to keep them down? It raises big questions because when you have such a cut off or internalized ruling elite, that is so out of touch, maybe like the Romanovs in Russia at the brink of the Russian Revolution, how disassociated are they with the common man? And they may not have a good sense of how far they're pushing it. They may be totally deluded. Who knows?
Based on the last couple McCain interviews I've seen, yeah, I would agree. And especially the town hall where the retired military personnel made a complete fool out of McCain.
Oh, God, I missed that. What happened?
I'll have to send you the link after the interview. But, yeah, he devastated him. He just trounced him.
Oh, wow. Wow. But, yeah, I think, and that's sorry?
Oh, sorry. I was just saying that McCain, Putin said something along the lines of we should have sympathy for him. He was, put in a pit and, beaten for a long time. And, of course, actually, I don't think he was in a pit. I don't think he was beaten. I think he sold out. I think he, but that's another story for all of us conspiracy theorists out there. But yeah, it is kind of crazy that we send these people like Victoria Nuland over to Kiev, and then we want to put in somebody like Yatsenyuk, who's, I mean, these people have no possible way of representing the Ukraine. I mean, one thing is he's a Scientologist.
Right.
right?
Right.
I mean, in a country where they've never heard of such things. I mean, has he
Right.
got like missing years that he spent in Los Angeles or maybe Tampa?
Oh yeah, I mean that's actually been rumored, and this is the thing, and keeping it on the subject, of course, but one can't forget that before or at the same time that L. Ron Hubbard was building up, his little Hollywood mafia, at the same time, or before that, he had a fleet of boats, and they were like off the African coast in the Mediterranean, and they were basically trying to sell their services to different, tin pot African dictators and saying, hey, we know how to build intelligence organizations, we know how to build states, we know how to do, population control, they're trying to sell their services, we know how to build, basically we could build you a little CIA, or, we can build you a little religion. And someone like Yatsenyuk is possibly an example of one of the services that Scientology provides.
Yeah, well, I'm familiar with the Clearwater, Florida area, so I'll just leave it at that. But let's just put it this way. I think I heard you in an interview with Morris, 108 Morris, talking about L. Ron Hubbard, and there's definitely the question of whether that wasn't a naval intelligence project that was kind of an early version of the privatization of the intelligence networks in the U.S. And,
well, yeah, I mean, that's, the digging there, obviously, and it was connected to the Manhattan Project as well. And, everyone knows that L. Ron Hubbard is a murderer, and, he killed Parsons and married his wife and took his money. And they had basically a Luciferian or satanic cult, around the ideas of Aleister Crowley. And they took some of those ideas and fused them with a French movement called Scientology from the 30s, which is unrelated, and some elements of, I guess you could call it Gnosticism, but I don't want to disparage that. That's a legitimate, branch of different theologies. But they took some of these ideas and they turned it into a service, and it was connected to the military as much as the people working on the A-bomb were connected to the military. So it was all there, and absolutely, L. Ron Hubbard had ties to the Navy, and he tried to build his own little small Navy, as we just said. So,
well, the interesting thing is they're so powerful in Hollywood,
mm-hmm.
and that raises some questions because, of course, Hollywood is ridiculously powerful.
Ridiculous.
And then that kind of raises again all these questions. They're doing tests, and I don't know, but on the internet there's a video that shows they opened their headquarters. They finally finished building it in Clearwater,
Mm-hmm.
and they spent tens of millions of dollars or whatever. And it's quite interesting to look in there. It's like a science fiction movie, but something along the lines of they might have 57 rooms to improve your 57 senses or whatever.
Oh, God.
And that might be from the traditional Indian, the cities or something, that
Mm-hmm.
we have all of these abilities that we're all suppressing. And I, generally speaking, I agree with them, but nonetheless, they're not the people I want to help me develop them.
Right. I mean, they're sort of like trying to imitate some of the tactics of the early Catholic Church. And I mean, they're for example, Jesus Christ could be a very real thing, and many people know that he is, or they don't think he is. But the point is that the church is not God, or and likewise Scientology deals with a lot of things that are true, and of course they mix in their own small lie to contaminate the whole thing. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that Scientology has tried to commercialize and patent, which have been known, throughout the ages, and was the wisdom of mystics and sages and priests, of course, for time immemorial.
Yeah, well, anyway, that whole Hollywood complex, and then to see a guy become a new leader in the Ukraine who's a Scientologist in a place, again, where nobody's heard of them, is rather surprising. I mean, I don't even know how to put it, but I mean, what if some really small kind of oddball group, it became the head of a major country? It'd be rather surprising.
Right. I mean, or, and it's so clearly there's something going on there. And the connection with Hollywood and how the media reported on the Ukraine situation. I mean, they really downplayed the fact that the Pravi sector were the thugs and the foot soldiers and involved in this, and they tried to make it seem like this was some sort of like combination of popular rebellion with a student movement, and kind of had this kind of rainbow flag, feel good, center left, 1968 vibe to it, when it was, completely this sinister plot, and involving remnants of Operation Gladio, and in combination with people who love the Nazi agent Bandera in Ukraine. And it's just it's disturbing, right? Because these Scientologists are probably the second most powerful mafia in Hollywood, and they control tons of people, and they control them through fear, and how are they going to control Yatsenyuk, right? Is Scientology really completely cut off from the military-industrial complex? You have people like President Obama, and the Chicago bathhouses, and his relationship with Rahm Emanuel, and George Clooney, right? And how is the gay mafia and the Scientology mafia working to manage that? It's a big question mark for me.
Well, I think I heard you in an interview essentially discussing, what would be my view is that there are all of these mafias, and then they compete, but they cooperate. And
Right.
Anyway, Scientology is one of the mafias in Hollywood. It's not the only one,
Right.
but it's certainly one of them. But there are others, and then there are mafias in D.C. or Chicago, and supposedly, I guess you would say one of them would be the whatever we might say, the political bathhouse,
Right.
mafia, for lack of a better word. But not really trying to pick on people. It's not really meant to do that. It's just meant to say that
it's there.
That this is a kind of way of controlling people. It's not so much for normal people. It's to have leverage over them, and that's the unfortunate part. But anyway, why don't we get back to the whole just broader strategy with Eurasia and some of the struggles going on? What you at the start of the interview said you think that a lot of interesting things may be just now starting. What did you mean by that? What are some of those interesting things that we might be seeing over the next few years?
Yeah, what you're going to see is big contests in the political campaigns in Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, Bosnia. The direction that those go are going to depend partly on what the Troika does in Greece. If groups in Greece that are at odds with each other, if a stronger centralizing force can bring them together, and people on the radical left and people on the radical right, if a stronger overarching coalition can be forged in Greece, that would be a game changer in the whole Balkans, because you have, of course, the Golden Dawn, and then you have the Syriza coalition on the left, and they both have similar views about the EU, and they're both against the IMF, and they're both against, actually they have the same foreign policy, but one group is hailing Hitler and the other one is in love with Leon Trotsky. So and that makes it very complicated. But in Bosnia, we've already seen the EU trying to foment an uprising in Bosnia, and people can Google that. There was they're trying to make it look like it's a labor uprising, because of course one thing that's used to counterpoise to different national struggles is a class struggle, and these can be, of course, combined, used against each other, juggled, or there's many different tools, ways that those can be used. But in Bosnia, they are trying to foment something like a class struggle, which is pro-EU. So basically to condemn Bosnia's relationship with the EU so far, which has led to IMF loans, austerity measures, and a reduction in pensions, an increase in the retirement age, closing of schools and hospitals, and then say, oh, because of that we need more EU, and then to basically stage a Gene Sharp inspired in Serbia and Bosnia, it was called Otpor, now called Canvas, and to inspire a change to the constitution which would abolish the federal state. So in general, you see that the Eurasianists are supporting federalism, where regions have more control, so which makes them able to resist IMF and resist EU agreements or including with Brussels. And then you have trying to basically eliminate the national character. Lots of people, to maybe inform some of your listeners, of course, in Bosnia and Serbia and Croatia, you have, mixed populations. And during the 90s, there was some successful ethnic cleansing, which pushed populations more into what are now the states. But Bosnia doesn't have a Bosnian ethnicity, right? So Bosniaks are basically Serbs who are Muslim, and then the Christian, rather Orthodox Bosnians are Serbians, and they have a whole half of the country which is called the Republika Srpska, which is not to be confused with the Republic of Serbia, where I am right next door. And there was the party in power here in Serbia, in Belgrade, is ostensibly a pro-EU party, but they couldn't have got elected if they didn't sit on a sort of coalition and breakaway of people who are Eurosceptics. So you might call them soft Eurosceptics that are playing the game, but the ruling party today in Serbia does have strong connections with the Russians. They did join as a observer status the Russian Joint Security Organization, and they are agreeing now to build a Russian military base in the south of Serbia.
Okay. Well, now I think this brings up a big question. So this EU is, like America, getting bigger and bigger, and is it overextended? Are there members in the EU who are actually secretly, for example, sympathetic to Russia? Sure. I don't know, Bulgaria or something.
Oh, goodness. Yeah.
Greece.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Greece is openly sympathetic. Romania in 2011, in the May 2011 elections, there was a big parliamentary revolution in Romania, which is a game changer. If any country in the Balkans is going to break out of the EU first, that's not Greece, it would be Romania. But Italy has strong ties with Russia, and the South Stream, the Ego Stream gas pipeline that's being built now through the Balkans, and it's going to go through Serbia, and has cut out Albania and has cut out Croatia, which are both staunch NATO allies, will end up going across the Adriatic and give gas directly to Italy. So Italy is not going to rely on the Russian gas that comes from Germany, right? So, and then of course, with Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, Spain, even though they're Western Europe, they haven't really seen, they haven't benefited from the EU in at least, according to polling and parliamentary results, they don't. And so that's the real question. I think one difference on the economic model of the United States is that it first of all, they print their own money, and the EU has only started to break away from any semblance of a fractional reserve banking, and they're only now starting to do some of the U.S. banking practices of printing money from thin air without respect to any ratio of reserves at all whatsoever. And another thing is that where the U.S. has a military-industrial complex, and much of the performance of the stock market is heavily tied to the big volume trading that's connected to some of the the secret funded projects, but also the public spending on the military. Europe is a little bit different because their sort of pyramid scheme, if you will, their Ponzi scheme is based upon the expansion of the EU and absorbing more member states, right? So where EU is really vulnerable is that when you see things like in Greece, right, or Spain, right, or possibly likely Romania, Serbia hasn't even joined the EU, and their a good decade away from even having an agreement about that.
Okay, well, a few questions, because we got a whole bunch of topics there.
Mm-hmm.
I just today or yesterday saw some media in Germany and Poland saying that the South Stream could now go essentially next to the Crimea instead of going in the deeper waters, and this would save $10 billion or something.
Mm-hmm.
So that's $10 billion is still a lot. I don't, right? Do you think the South Stream is going to go through?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's going to go through. And all the governments in the Balkans agree to it. And the EU has to agree to it, whether they want to agree or not. The U.S. doesn't want that at all. I mean, it wants, right, it thinks it has shale. And it also just,
That's a scam. Joaquin.
Yeah,
the
it
shale
is
basically a scam.
There's no way to get that over. You're absolutely right, but they're pretending that there's an alternative, and the reason they need to pretend to save face is because in truth, when I say the United States, I'm not talking about Americans, and I'm saying the people who are running the United States, of course, and the people who are running the United States, to the extent that they are the unilateralists or the neocons, they would do a Vietnam. They would kill the village to save they would burn the village to save the village, basically, with Europe. I mean, they would actually rather see Europe, fall into a dark ages rather than continue building its economic relationship with Russia. And they know that also, German technology and German engineering and all of the best stuff that still exists in Europe is moving east. So it goes two ways. It's not just like Eurasian influence is encroaching Paris, but Paris and Berlin have more tentacles in Moscow than ever before, right? Like we said before, there's over 10,000 German enterprises, multi-million euro enterprises from Germany, over 10,000 of them operating today in Russia. So how does the U.S. see that as a threat? It's pretty obvious.
Well, it's the Baghdad to Berlin railway problem.
Right.
I mean, it's if you control the oceans, you don't want anything that isn't under the oceans. So,
right.
There's that. Well, you mentioned Greece with Cyprus or whatever, and Syriza Party and the Golden Dawn. And so my understanding is essentially now that for lack of a better word, you have this left-wing challenge and right-wing challenge to the mainstream parties.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, combined, they must be like 65% of the population now,
right, exactly,
if not more.
Mm-hmm.
This raises all kinds of questions. I mean, some argue that the banking collapse in Cyprus was an attack on Russia, an attack on Gazprom.
Yeah, it was.
And so this kind of raises some questions. I mean, can't Russia do more with Greece or Cyprus?
It's so difficult.
Or what are they doing, actually?
Yeah, well, what on the economic front, Putin has already told Greece that they would pay off if Greece wanted to break away from the EU, that they would pay off their loans and set up a different loan structure that was more competitive with better interest rates and over time, and also including other goodies like gas and oil. So they've laid that out there. On the ideological front, it's been a real difficult time for Russia. They do a lot of their ideological work when you involve either extreme right or extreme left. That's when they rely on Alexander Dugin to try to create this sort of like fourth position and to try to get people to the table to get sort of like the radical right-wing nationalists and the radical left-wing communists to come to an agreement. And that's been one of the sort of more exotic tasks of the Kremlin in recent years through the work of Alexander Dugin. And so what you see in Greece is you have, like you said, probably more than half or maybe even 2/3 of the population has the same view on how the economy should be structured, on who their friends should be, so economics and foreign relations, they agree. The Golden Dawn and the Syriza, they agree on most of those things. But they're getting all caught up on the sort of the cultural Marxist issues, right? They're getting caught up on the things like, gay rights and immigration and what is the ethnic identity of a Greek and how important is race and ethnicity. So the neo-Nazis, of course, or the Golden Dawn, they don't like immigrants, and they don't, and they, they think that homosexuality is just like the worst thing that's ever happened to humanity. And then you have, the communists who take an extreme radical approach in the other direction. They want like free sex changes for everyone, and they want to just open the doors to migrants. And, probably both approaches are too extreme, but that's where they've got them divided. And that's not on accident, right? That's how the divide and conquer system works.
Sounds like the whole Western world.
Yeah, right.
I was going to run by you what's going on with Moldova's Transnistria region. Mm-hmm. And also, it seems like what happened with Crimea is sort of sparking a secessionist fervor around the globe, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Transnistria is actually still a Soviet socialist republic.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
I thought.
Mm-hmm.
I know, like.
Well, hey, Jerry, NATO invaded, though. They killed like 1,000 people.
There was a small war there.
Yeah, I thought the
back
Russians...
in the 90s, back in the 1990s, NATO tried to take it over.
Okay, so it's maybe they're just still a little ticked off at NATO because I think Russia's got some peacekeeping troops there, do they not?
Yes, they do.
To keep NATO out.
Yes.
Yeah, well, that's one way to keep peace.
It's actually very similar to Crimea because it's part of another country, right? It's part of Moldova, but it's an autonomous republic within it. So they have some rights to secede. Of course, that's on the legal level, and one would contest it. And of course, the final determinant is, who's the actual, de facto powers, how these things really break down, just like with the U.S. Civil War and so forth. But in theory, in legal principle, they have the right to secede, and there would be the possibility. It's a very small population, talking about something like 300,000 people, but they would have the right to have a referendum and join the Russian Federation. And as they exist today, they still have like the old hammer and sickle. It's pretty incredible. They still have the old hammer and sickle flag, and their government is still called the Supreme Soviet. And it's kind of like a flashback to an earlier age, a forgotten time. And they're definitely still pro-Russian. And there's a very, very small port there that could be expanded, which is about 50 kilometers over to the side from Odessa, which is a tiny little bit of piece of water going to the Black Sea, which that small autonomous republic has access to. And the Russians will probably expand that.
So I assume it's a very strategic location then for the Russians.
Yeah, it also boxes in Ukraine. So if you look at the map and you pull that up and you see if, Western Ukraine were to break away from Eastern Ukraine, well, they'd be boxed in by this tiny little, pro-Russian former Soviet republic right on their side. And it also increases pressure on Moldova itself. And that's why Russia may not play that card, because and that's why people said that Russia wouldn't play the Crimea card, because until things got crazy in Ukraine, the fact that Russia always could do what they did in Crimea was, tremendous leverage, right? And so would they play that card right away? Moldova is itself, kind of like part of Romania, right? So you kind of have you have like Moldova breakaway, and then you have like a smaller little Moldova, right? And of course, Romania sees itself, even though they're Orthodox and they consider themselves to be kind of like Slavs. They have a very large Roma Gypsy population, and culturally they really identify with the Latin Empire. From the Fourth Crusade of 1204, they really identify with the Roman Empire, even though they have a Patriarch of Romania and they're Orthodox. So it's a very interesting thing, Whereas in Moldova they still use Cyrillic and they use the Slavic written language, whereas in Romania they use Latinic, and they see themselves very much as like Romans.
Well, Romania backed the Germans in World War II. and
Yeah.
they wanted to take over Odessa, and so I don't know. I mean, Romania might not be happy with the EU, but I don't think they're friends with Russia.
Yeah.
And that problem with
Yeah.
Moldova just makes it worse. So, I mean, that's just another issue there. But of course, that whole area, the Odessa area, I think if the Ukraine breaks up, that actually I think Russia would want to make sure to take that.
Oh yeah, they would. Yeah, that's already lined up. That's yeah.
In other words, if I don't know, the areas next to Russia were to vote to break away or whatever, I don't know how it would play out. I think the vote would go in favor of joining Russia or whatever, breaking away. But no matter what, I think Russia would pay the money or send in the insurgents or do whatever they needed to, because they're not going to let some, key areas like Odessa fall for no reason when it could easily be gained.
Yeah, this is Russia's sphere of influence. They consider this their front porch or their backyard or whatever. And yeah, I mean you're not going to have there's just no way conceivably on the cultural level for them or in their own sense of their own trajectory, their own sense of meaning and purpose, which is kind of absent in the West. Sort of existential question, or what is the purpose of the United States, right? Russia is a little bit different because they
shopping, Joaquin, shopping.
Right. Yeah, Russia has sort of a clear sense of identity, historical trajectory going past 1,000 years back in time and forward, and so they kind of know who they are, whereas Americans are, it's a melting pot, and it's a constitutional framework, of course. So I think Americans might identify with that, but it's not really the same as Russia, which really is sort of ethnic and historical and cultural, linguistic, and it goes back to before the Middle Ages, right? So when they look at things happening in Ukraine, they're not looking at just the 20th century or just the 19th century, right? They're looking at the years before the Mongol invasion, So it's a very different ballgame for them.
For sure. That's also partly the issue here is kind of, well, what do you call it? Weltanschauungskrieg? It's kind of a struggle for how you view the world too.
Right.
And that's what we saw with the U.S. spending billions and billions of dollars in the Ukraine to try to radicalize them. Propaganda and rewrite all the textbooks and whatever. It's a picture of the world kind of question. Well, I tell you what, I got one more topic that I think is fairly serious. You're in Serbia, and that's an interesting country. It suffered terrible NATO bombing and even now all kinds of problems. And I guess they use depleted uranium, right?
Yep. Yeah. A friend of mine has got cancer still.
Oh, well, I'm sorry to hear that. What can you tell us about the view of the world from Serbia? What do things look like there?
Well, there's some interesting things going on here. Of course, like we said, what's interesting is that they do the sort of like standard polling, like Rasmussen polling and the various polling organizations. So they do scientific polling of the population on like certain questions. So there's no guesswork about how Serbians feel about certain issues, and it breaks down the same way. The general figure is between 2/3 and 70%, and sometimes upwards of 80% of Serbians feel the following way about the following issues. They feel close to Russia. They're against the EU. They're against NATO. They are 90 or 95% Orthodox Christian. They use the Cyrillic language, unlike Romania, so they're closer to the Russians in that sense. They see themselves, in the history of Serbia, it was always considered like another Malo Russia. Serbia has a distinct identity, a distinct culture. It was part of the Ottoman Empire, of course, but when during the years of the Great Game, and when the British were seeking to break off pieces of the Balkans from the Ottoman Empire, of course, they recognized a new line of royalty in Greece, 1828 to 1838, and of course in Serbia around the same time, they helped with Russia broker an agreement to establish Serbia as an autonomous free country from the Ottoman Empire, and yet at the same time, and it's still the same case today, moving forward, almost 200 years, that the general accepted view and the paradigm of the powers that be still today is that Serbia is Russia's key to the Adriatic and the Mediterranean, and so for that reason they cut Montenegro off of Serbia about almost 8 years ago now. But the way that Serbia has been handled and mistreated by the Western powers, fits the model of Iraq. It fits the model of other examples like that. So what's happening today now is that you have a party in power, which I have in my analysis, and I've written about this, is very similar in many ways to Yanukovych's party of regions, because they're trying to sit in two seats. There are some differences. For example, like the radical right wing in Serbia is anti-Nazi, and they're pro-Serbian. They have their own tradition. They're not pro-Soviet, but they're pro-Russian, and they're Orthodox. And so that's very different from Ukraine. So that means that in Serbia, in the coming year, 18 months, as things get more interesting, I forecast, you're going to see the fake left and the kind of the middle-class university student-style protest that's going to be like a more left-wing thing that's going to focus on gay pride and rights of gypsies and basically trying to condemn Serbia for alleged war crimes against the NATO allies during the Third Balkans War 15 years ago. And so it's going to come from the left. And that's very different from Ukraine, where it came from the right. But other than that, it will be very similar because the party in power is trying to do things that make the Russians happy and Europe happy. And so that's not going to lead them in a great place in the coming years.
Well, I mean, the obvious thing is that Russia is tremendously more powerful or influential now than, say, 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And overall, that's a very good thing for Serbia because Serbia is kind of like their cousin or big brother or whatever.
Right, exactly.
Russia is Serbia's big brother or whatever. But, yeah, that's a tough question. But it also depends on how the EU goes. I mean, so we don't really know.
Exactly.
What about, again, getting back to that at the beginning of the interview where you said you're expecting some of these big changes in the next few years. Any other thoughts on big changes we might be seeing? I mean, I think a key question is Russia going to really, truly push to develop Central Asia and reorient towards China? I mean, as an example, Putin and I guess the Russian Duma have now approved moving headquarters of companies to the Pacific. Mm-hmm. And the tax rates, if you have a headquarters there, will be ridiculously low, let's say 5%. Instead of the terrible communistic tax rate of 13%, if you're in Moscow. So all these terrible communists in the free world can appreciate the communism of 5% tax rate.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's the thing. China and Russia are in lockstep agreement about all the issues that relate to NATO, but they also see themselves as competing regional hegemons, and they have conflict over questions relating to Mongolia. They have differences over things relating to, say, Kazakhstan, and in the areas that border between China and Russia. So moving forward, what their mutual strategy, of course, is it's so triangulated because China is the largest holder of the U.S. debt, and so China, if China didn't exist, and I know it's a chicken or egg thing, but if China didn't exist, or wasn't doing what it was doing, the U.S. economy would collapse. But and so at the same time that China on the front of international relations and geostrategy is on the side of the Russians, in the area of finance, they would kind of like to see the U.S. be able to pay things or function, right?
Yeah, but Joaquin, the U.S. isn't paying them.
No, they're not, right?
Okay, so China is already written off. I mean, look, they just want to do things in a peaceful way that takes 10 years or something.
Right.
A sale to the U.S. gives you paper.
Mm-hmm.
When you want to use the paper, the U.S. prevents you.
Right.
When China wants to buy an oil company, they can't. When they want to put down infrastructure in New Zealand or Asia, the phone system cables and all that, the U.S. says no because it'll interfere with their spying capabilities.
Right.
Right. So
right.
China is allowed to buy some small dairy in New Zealand, right? Because it doesn't mess with anything important. But the point is, that's not enough. They're sitting on trillions of dollars, and they can't use those dollars.
Right.
So a sale to the U.S. is not remotely as good as a barter deal with, let's say, Germany or India or something.
Yeah, and just the other day, China and Germany made an agreement to open up a something like what will be like the nucleus of a trading house directly between Germany and China. So, but I guess my point being with that is that if the U.S. Still has some intelligent people somewhere doing stuff, they might be able to encourage China to pressure Russia over those areas that we discussed in the border regions, between Russia and China. But absolutely, as it stands now, I mean, if you want to talk about interesting things to occur over there, I try not to give too many speculations or forecasting on that because that's not what I studied. That's not my area of expertise per se. So I wouldn't want to give any misinformation and or be accused of giving disinformation. But I do know as a fact that on the doctrine level of Russian military thinking that they do see China not as being like 100% ally, right? There are rivalries and tensions, and they do, and part of their foreign policy is to contain some elements of each other's activities.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Jerry.
Well, I was going to ask earlier. You said that Italy had, rather friendly relations with Russia, and I was wondering, do you think that the Berlusconi takedown was because they're trying to sabotage those relations? Partly?
Yeah, I do. That's a great example of that. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would elaborate more, except I think everyone knows about Berlusconi and Putin and what happened. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're spot on. That's corroborating evidence.
Okay, and one more question I wanted to ask you about fourth political theory. I kind of asked it earlier, but I think it got lost in the shuffle. Was what's the view of the relationship vis-a-vis Russia to Turkey compared to Iran? Because I think I read Dugin said that Russia should align with Turkey, but if they did align with Turkey, would that would kind of go against their alignment with Iran, would it not?
Yeah, right. Well, all of these presuppose a different government in Turkey. So,
what kind of government?
One probably led by or friends of Dogu Perenchek and the Workers' Party. So it would be on the face of it a communist government, but a very different type of more like national communism, not Marxism, at least not in the Western or Soviet sense. But it would be a Workers' Party government. This was what was the whole deal with the Ergenekon conspiracy and the Workers' Party. I mean, this is not like a few college students with Che Guevara shirts, right? This is like a whole large section of the top brass of the military establishment. The Workers' Party was successful in uniting kind of like the radical right, Kemalist nationalists, and the left-wing Kemalist nationalists, and the left-wing Marxists, Maoists, all under one banner. It was a very impressive organizing effort on their part. And they are one of the largest threats to the powers that be in Turkey today. And now with the AKP losing some of its backing from Gulen and the Islamicists, Erdogan is sitting on a very unstable table. And so, right. So when so the position of Dugin and the 4PT with that is that you would need the government in Iran is okay, and they support a change of government in Turkey, and Iran and Turkey have tremendously interpenetrated economies. In the world of geopolitics and geostrategy, they're at odds over a lot of different issues, and they're basically fighting a proxy war against each other in Syria, right? But actually, there's tons of they haven't really lashed out against each other directly. Iranian businessmen freely travel in Turkey, and Turkish businessmen freely travel in Iran. They share a lot of history, going back to the beginning of written history. There's often been an Iranian ruling class in Turkey, and there's been other times where Turkish cultural influence has been connected to the ruling class in Iran. And even though they have different historical histories, they're also both related to Khwarezm and Khazar people of the Caspian Sea. And of course, modern Turkey, much of the ethnicity before the modern ethnogenesis comes from the east and right in the region of the Caspian Sea. So you're talking like Armenia, Azerbaijan, and then on the other side of the Caspian Sea in the traditional region, which used to be a sort of Khazar-related area called Khwarezm, which is an Indo-Iranian empire, which was connected also with the Parthians. So they're not unaware of this. In the West, we have this thing, we think, history started with like the Magna Carta, and then we jump forward to 1776, and that's it. But, the rest of the world and the elites and educated university people, they're well aware of this, and they know their own story, obviously better than we do. But, the position of Eurasianism is that you would see a change of government in Turkey, right? So then they wouldn't have the NATO problem where they're at odds with Iran. The rest of like the basic like business, telecom, stock market stuff. I mean, Turkey and Iran already share a lot, so it's not.
How do you unelect Gladio?
Yeah, how do you unelect Gladio? Right. Well, you need kind of like your own version of Gladio.
I think Norway showed how that works out.
Yeah, right.
Don't send your kids to islands if you're an elite person,
Mm-hmm.
because that island will have a guy or two or three or 10, and the police won't get there for hours and hours. And then when they do get there, they'll know who he was and they'll say hello. Right.
Yeah. I mean, the U.S. will. Obviously your listeners know all kinds of stuff about, Sandy Hook or the Boston Marathon stuff. And of course that stuff that they have been doing abroad in Europe all throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And they brought into Central New Europe, and they played a little bit with that in Romania recently with the bus bombing, trying to pin that on Iran. So, will they do that in Turkey? Well, that's the thing. American NGOs and American Black Ops and Gladio type groups are operating in Turkey. They want to pull Turkey in one direction. There's a big difference, however. It's not, even though the Russians have NGOs and military ties through Ergenekon and through the Workers' Party in Turkey. I should be clear to state first that the Communist Party of the Russian Federation is a loyal opposition to the Kremlin, and that the Workers' Party and the Communist Party Russian Federation have a very, very, very close relationship and very good relationship today, and that Putin has and I say Putin, I mean the Russian establishment, but for your listeners, I say Putin. Putin, of course, has like very, very close ties with the uprising that we saw in Gezi Park. The organizing then, and Dogu Perenchek's Workers' Party, he owns a TV station, right? And it was like the only TV station in the whole country which gave sympathetic or favorable coverage, right, of the protesters at Gezi Park. So I think a lot of people who are familiar with, colored revolutions and false flags, hoaxes, and Arab Spring and Occupy, when they heard about the stuff happening in Turkey, they go, oh, right, there goes the Americans again, and with their Gene Sharp and Saul Alinsky stuff, right? But actually, this was a little bit different because the Russians are heavily involved in that, and I think that is a big threat to the Americans. And so, getting back to the other question, why don't the Russians roll in the tanks? Hey, you know what? They're kind of relearning the lessons of the Third International, which is so the Russians don't need an army to come in. Are you with me?
Yes.
And when they are relearning, I mean, with the whole idea of the Americans using the ideas of Saul Alinsky and Gene Sharp and the way that they organized, solidarity in Poland in the 80s, the solidarity movement in Poland, or the way that they organized Otpor and later Canvas in the former Yugoslavia. Those were all basically based on a person who, Gene Sharp, who spent a lot of time around Marxist revolutionaries in the United States, and his works are based somewhat on the ideas as well of Saul Alinsky, who was a pro-American, anti-Soviet Marxist.
Operative.
Operative, yeah, right, operative. And he synthesized basically the tactics that when the Third International was started and being run by Zinoviev out of the Kremlin, and of course you had in the United States, you had leaders like James P. Cannon, who went on to form, who was one of the founding members of the American Communist Party, later CPUSA, and he was also the co-founder of the Socialist Workers Party. There was a long time when the Soviets understood that, and then they kind of lost this technology, and the technology moved west, and Stalin dissolved the Comintern and started the Common Form, of course. And then the foreign policy of Khrushchev was pretty abysmal, and later Soviet leaders they focused mostly on Africa and somewhat on Latin America, but they didn't really fund the projects the way that the Soviet Union was really, when they were going really full speed in the 1920s with the funding of the Third International. So a lot of that technology they lost, or they lost the money to fund it, or they made other agreements. And of course there was détente, there was the arms race and the space race, and they kind of got away from the idea. They funded the peace movement instead, and they got away from the idea of funding like armed or political revolutions in the Western Bloc. So, but
hey,
yes.
Joaquin, I think though I think before we wrap it up here, though, there's something very important to mention about this whole Eurasian thing. It's not simply a question of like China or Turkey. It's what Brzezinski was getting at in his book, The Grand Chessboard, is if you build heavy rail and pipelines and all these other things, you will make it in the economic interests of the elites in all these countries to work together.
Right.
And they will make a fortune because a lot of these areas have been unexploited in the sense that there are just minerals sitting on the ground, and they could never be taken before because you couldn't get a truck or a pipeline or heavy equipment there.
Right.
Right. And I think the strategy that needs to be mentioned is it's not just a question of bribing a politician. It's that just for the sake of the argument, let's say there's heavy rail that goes through whatever, 8 countries going from Germany to China. Okay, that heavy rail is carrying all those minerals, and those minerals are needed in, let's say, Germany and China. And all along the way, the people are paying royalties, even if it's not from your country.
Right.
But some of the stuff on the heavy rail will come from your country. So the point is, all of those countries can start to have 7% annual, GDP growth or whatever.
Right.
Okay, tremendous booms, and not from derivatives. I mean, actual real economic growth.
That's right.
And if you have those heavy rail and pipelines and all that other kind of stuff going through, it won't be in your interests to try to have a war or an attack, for example, on Russia or China.
Right. Because
you don't want the rail broken up.
Exactly.
And so this is kind of like a peaceful economic, grand alliance, grand chessboard.
Yes.
And I think that's why you see things like the U.S. having this pointless, endless war in Afghanistan as one of the main points, is that means that it's harder to develop Eurasia. Mm-hmm. Iran can't send a pipeline to China through Afghanistan if there's a war there.
Right, exactly.
And so I just want to close on the point that the Eurasian idea means tremendous economic benefits to these countries.
Yes,
Far
absolutely.
greater, really, than the EU has brought to Western Europe, because they already had rails and roads and, canals and stuff. But we're talking about a part of the world where they haven't had it.
Right. And another component is the cultural angle, because what they're also promoting is a something like an anti-consumerism. So there's this component of the Eurasian movement, which is connected to, it's like this undercurrent within the sort of pragmatic, Eurasian customs union, where culturally, and I think this is where they connect with Iran and connect with China and connect with Russia's own sort of medievalist orthodoxy, is a sort of rejection of materialism and so forth. So if you can promote a culture, right, which the cost of sustaining individuals is less, right, because they're not trying to buy 85-inch TVs or something, or brand new Ford Mustang every 2 years, then you have a complete different reorganization of the economy. You've changed expectations, right? Because in the West, a lot of the unrest is partly due to unfulfilled material expectations, in the inner cities and so forth. So they're also looking at long-term changes and reintroducing religion, reintroducing, existentialism and all kinds of, philosophies which are pre-modern, but may ultimately be more postmodern than the Frankfurt School.
That's quite a thought. That's quite a thought. Back to the Future or something like that, or
Right.
post-consumerism or something
Right.
like that.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, Joaquin, let's call it a wrap. We've got a lot to chew over there, and we really appreciate you coming. We could go on all night, I'm afraid.
Right.
But it's been informing, and we do appreciate it. And thanks so much for coming.
Thanks,
Paul.
Joaquin.
I just want to say thank you guys for having me, and to Paul and the gang. And you guys have been great. And I'm here whenever you need me. And it was a great show. And you have a very excellent show. And I hope I've been able to be of some service to your audience.
Well, again, food for thought, and you've been thinking about these things for a long time, so we appreciate it. That's it, folks. Till next time. Bye-bye.